It began not with a whisper of gossip, but with the stark, visible evidence of labor that made no sense. On the high meadow where he had lived for 40 years, Abner began laying a new foundation. This, in itself, was not unusual. Men in this territory were always building, expanding, or replacing structures worn down by the unforgiving cycle of seasons. His neighbors watched from a distance as he hauled fieldstones on a sledge, his shoulders bent but his pace unyielding. They assumed he was building a new barn, a larger one to replace the lean-to that had served him since his wife, Martha, had passed. The old one was sagging, its timbers silvered and split by sun and frost. A new barn was a logical, respectable project for a man entering the winter of his own life. But then the logic dissolved. The foundation stones were not laid adjacent to his small, sturdy cabin, they were laid around it. A wide, rectangular footprint emerged from the earth, encompassing the cabin entirely, leaving a gap of some 12 feet on all sides. It was the work of a man intending to build a box around a box. Samuel, his nearest neighbor a mile to the east, rode over one afternoon, reining in his horse where Abner was wrestling a heavy beam into place. The frame was going up now, a skeleton of fresh-hewn pine that dwarfed the little house it was meant to contain. The scent of cut wood was sharp and clean on the air. "Abner," Samuel called out, his voice carrying a note of friendly confusion. "It's a fine frame. Sturdy. But you've laid it out peculiar." Abner paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at the frame, then at his cabin, as if seeing the relationship between the two for the first time. "It'll serve," was all he said, his voice as dry as the late summer dust. The answer, or lack thereof, traveled back with Samuel and spread through the small community like a slow-moving creek. In the general store, Mr. Finch leaned on his counter and offered his opinion to a handful of ranchers. "He's putting a barn over his house." "Not next to it." Over it the men shook their heads. They understood grief. They knew loneliness could curdle a man's mind. Abner had always been quiet, but never foolish. This project, however, was a monument to foolishness. It was inefficient, wasting lumber and defying every principle of practical construction they had ever known. The laughter was quiet at first, a kind of sympathetic chuckling. But as the walls went up, the laughter grew louder, more confident. The structure was an absurdity, a testament to a man's descent into eccentricity. They didn't see the quiet intensity in his eyes or the methodical precision of his work, they saw only the strange shape it was taking against the vast, empty sky. Abner paid no mind to the talk, for he was listening to other, older whispers. He had seen things this year that stirred a deep and ancient unease within him, a feeling he had not known since he was a boy listening to his grandfather's tales of the long winters, the ones that came to be known by name like unwelcome visitors who stayed too long. The signs were small, easily dismissed by those with shorter memories. The aspen leaves had turned a month early, not into their usual vibrant gold, but a pale, sickly yellow before dropping from the branches in a single, windy night, leaving the trees bare and skeletal against the deepening blue of the autumn sky. He had watched the beavers on the lower creek, their dams higher and thicker than he had ever seen, reinforced with mud and stones until they resembled small fortresses. The squirrels, usually frantic and chattering, were now scarce, their work of hoarding pine cones and acorns apparently finished long before the first frost was due. Even the air felt different. It lacked the crisp, invigorating bite of a normal autumn, carrying instead a heavy stillness, a sense of waiting. The silence in the high country was profound, the elk had already moved down to the sheltered valleys, and the migratory birds that usually filled the mornings with song had vanished weeks ago, their departure sudden and absolute. He remembered a story from his grandfather, a man who had come to these mountains when they were truly wild. He spoke of a winter of the deep snow, a season so brutal it had reshaped the land itself, burying cabins and wiping out entire herds of buffalo. It began, his grandfather had said, with a silent autumn. A season of subtle warnings that only the animals and the old ones seemed to understand. While the other ranchers in the valley saw a mild, pleasant fall, perfect for fattening their cattle on the last of the summer grass, Abner saw a deception. He saw the calm before a storm, not of days or weeks, but of months. He was a man who lived by the cycles of the land, and the cycle was broken. This knowledge settled not as fear, but as a cold, hard certainty in his bones. It was the same certainty that had guided him to select the strongest timbers for his project, to sink his foundation posts deeper than any man would have thought necessary. His neighbors saw an old man's folly taking shape. He knew he was building an ark, not for a flood of water, but for a flood of snow and cold. The quiet laughter from the town did not reach him up on his meadow, and if it had, it would have been drowned out by the louder, more insistent warnings of the silent, waiting world around him. The structure rose with the steady rhythm of Abner's labor, each timber cut and fitted with a purpose that remained entirely his own. It was a barn, but it was unlike any barn the region had ever seen. The outer walls were thick, double-planked with a space between that he began to painstakingly fill with sod and packed earth, a technique used for sod houses on the plains but almost unheard of for a wooden barn. This created an immense, insulated barrier against the elements. Inside, the space was cavernous. On one end, he built stalls for his 2 horses and his milk cow, along with pens for his few chickens. But these were not ordinary stalls. He constructed a raised wooden walkway that connected directly to a new, heavily reinforced door he had built into the back of his cabin. From his own home, he could walk, under cover, to tend to his animals, gather eggs, or get milk, all without ever being exposed to the outside. The central area of the barn was a massive, open space for storage. Here he stacked firewood, not in cords, but in great, solid walls of oak and pine that reached halfway to the rafters, enough to last 3 ordinary winters. He piled sacks of grain, oats, and flour, and hung cured meats from the high beams. A large cistern for water, fed by a clever system of gutters he designed to catch any future rain or snowmelt, stood in one corner. The most peculiar feature, however, was the space between the cabin's original roof and the new, towering roof of the barn. This vast, empty attic, a dozen feet high, created a massive pocket of dead air. It was a blanket of nothing, the most effective insulation he could devise. When Mr. Finch from the mercantile made a special trip out with a delivery of nails and salt, he stood in the half-finished structure, shaking his head in disbelief. "Abner, what is the point of all this?" he asked, his voice echoing in the enormous space. "You've got a house inside your barn. A man could get lost in here." Abner, securing a rafter overhead, looked down. "It's all one place now," he said simply. "Easier to keep warmer." Mr. Finch was not convinced. "It's a fortress." "You expecting an army?" The question was meant as a joke, but Abner's response was serious. An army of a different sort. This exchange sealed Abner's reputation in the valley. He was no longer just eccentric, he was touched. The men at the saloon now told tales of Abner's folly, or the madman's keep. They joked that he was preparing for a second great flood or that he intended to hide from the government's tax collectors. The laughter had an edge of cruelty now, the kind reserved for those who stepped too far outside the bounds of communal understanding. They could not comprehend that every nail he drove, every plank he placed, was an answer to a question the land itself was asking. They saw a man consumed by a strange obsession, while he was simply a man who knew how to listen to the silence and prepare for the storm it promised. The days grew shorter, the sun's arc lowering across the southern sky, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at the land. A chill settled deep into the soil, and the work became a desperate race against the coming freeze. Abner's hands, already tough as old leather, were now cracked and raw, but they never stopped. He worked from the first hint of grey light in the east until the last embers of daylight faded in the west, his movements fueled by a relentless urgency. He was a solitary figure against the vast, darkening landscape, his hammer blows a lonely percussion in the immense quiet. He moved his entire workshop inside the new structure, his forge, his anvil, his tools, creating a space where he could continue to make repairs even when the world outside was locked in ice. He then undertook the most arduous task of all, moving a winter's worth of hay. Wagonload by wagonload, he transferred the sweet-smelling fodder from the old, open-sided rick into the protected central bay of his new barn, piling it high until it formed a fragrant, insulating mountain beside the walls of firewood. This act, more than any other, baffled his neighbors. Storing hay indoors on such a scale was unheard of. It was a fire risk and a waste of valuable interior space. Samuel rode over again, his face etched with genuine concern this time. "Abner, that's too much hay to keep inside," he warned, gesturing toward the massive pile. "One stray spark from your forge, and this whole place will go up like a torch." Abner paused from his work, his breath pluming in the cold air. "The forge is on a stone bed, far from the hay. It's safer here than under a blanket of snow so deep I can't dig it out." The simplicity of the logic was both undeniable and, to Samuel, completely mad. It was preparation for a catastrophe no one could imagine. As the final, heavy doors of the barn were hung and barred, the community's view of him solidified. He was a pariah, a man who had walled himself off, not just physically, but socially. Children were told not to wander near the old man's property. Wives spoke of him in hushed tones, a sad story of a mind broken by loss. They saw his fortress not as a shield, but as a tomb he was building for himself. The first snowflakes began to fall the day he sealed the last gap in the walls, not the light, feathery flakes of a gentle winter's arrival, but small, hard pellets that hissed as they struck the ground. They did not melt. They stayed. Within an hour, a thin white sheet covered the meadow. Inside his vast enclosure, Abner checked the latches on the doors, the seal around his cabin windows, and the comfort of his animals. There was no sense of triumph, only a quiet, grim readiness. The laughter had faded from the valley, replaced by the low, mournful sound of the rising wind. The storm did not arrive, it fell. It descended from the slate-gray sky not as a weather front, but as a collapsing wall of white. One moment, the world was visible, etched in sharp, cold detail. The next, it was gone, erased by a blinding, shrieking blizzard that descended with the force of a physical blow. The wind, which had been a low moan for days, became a high, predatory scream that tore at anything not anchored to the bedrock. Within hours, the familiar contours of the landscape vanished, buried under a relentless deluge of snow. Drifts that were typically formed over a week of steady snowfall appeared in a single afternoon, swallowing fences, burying sheds, and piling up against the north-facing walls of homesteads with terrifying speed. In the town, and on the scattered ranches, a stunned disbelief gave way to a primal fear. This was not a storm, it was a siege. Temperatures plummeted to levels that defied memory and thermometers, freezing exposed livestock where they stood and turning the simple act of fetching wood from an outdoor pile into a life-threatening expedition. The very air became a weapon, searing the lungs and crystallizing the moisture in a man's beard into a mask of ice. The world shrank to the four walls of a cabin, and the primary sound of existence became the howling of the wind and the groaning of timbers under an unimaginable weight of snow. But inside Abner's compound, a different reality unfolded. The roar of the storm was muffled, reduced to a distant, hollow thunder by the thick, insulated walls of the outer barn. The wind could not find purchase on the sheer, solid structure. Inside, the air was still and cold, but not lethally so. The ambient heat from the animals and the thick barrier of the outer walls kept the temperature within the barn well above the deadly freeze outside. Abner moved through his interconnected world with a calm deliberateness. He lit a single lantern, its golden light pushing back the gloom. He walked the raised wooden path from his cabin's back door, the familiar creak of the boards a comforting sound against the storm's muffled rage. He fed the horses and the cow, their warm breath misting in the still air. He collected the eggs from the hens, who were ruffled but safe in their protected coop. He was not merely surviving, he was living. The structure had transformed from a building into a self-contained ecosystem, a sanctuary against a world that had become instantly hostile to life. He could work at his forge, mend a harness, and cook his meal on his cabin stove, all while the blizzard raged just a few feet away, powerless to touch him. He was an island of calm in a sea of elemental fury, and the laughter of his neighbors was now a forgotten echo, buried under the silent, suffocating weight of the snow. Weeks bled into a month, and the world outside the compound remained a void of howling wind and white darkness. Time for Abner ceased to be marked by the sun, which he had not seen since the storm fell, but by the simple, repeating rhythm of chores. His life was a closed loop, a self-sustaining orbit of predictable tasks. He would rise in the near darkness of his cabin, the air within chilled but still. He would light his stove, the smell of coffee a small, comforting anchor in the vast silence. Then he would walk the covered path to the main barn, the lantern in his hand casting a warm, dancing glow on the rough-hewn timbers. The animals greeted him with low sounds, their presence a steady, living warmth in the immense cold. He would fork hay into their stalls, his movements unhurried and efficient, listening to the satisfying crunch as they ate. He would milk the cow, the rhythmic hiss into the paler sound as regular as a clock's tick. After the animals were tended, he would turn his attention to his own stores. He was a meticulous steward of his resources, measuring out the grain, checking the cured hams, and ensuring the water in the cistern remained clear. His days were filled not with idleness, but with the quiet industry of maintenance. He sharpened his axes on the grindstone, mended harnesses with waxed thread, and worked his small forge, the clang of hammer on steel a defiant noise against the storm's oppressive roar. The work kept his mind occupied and his body strong, staving off the deep melancholy that such profound isolation could bring. Once, driven by a need to see, he climbed a ladder to a small, high window he had built into the barn's gable. He spent the better part of an hour chipping away the thick, opaque ice that had formed on the inside of the glass. When he finally cleared a small circle, he pressed his face to it and saw nothing. Not the familiar peaks of the mountains, not the dark line of the distant forest, not even the sky. He saw only a seamless, suffocating expanse of white, a landscape so utterly buried it had lost all feature and dimension. It was as if the world he had known had been wiped clean, and he was the last man, floating in a silent, frozen sea. He felt a tremor of true solitude then, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. He climbed down the ladder, the image burned into his mind, and went back to his forge, the weight of his foresight now a heavy but necessary burden. The change, when it came, was not visual but auditory. After what he guessed had been nearly 2 months, the ceaseless, high-pitched scream of the wind began to lose its edge. It softened into a low, guttural moan, then a sigh, and finally, after another week, it fell into a profound and unsettling silence. The world was utterly still. For the first time, he could hear the faint, slow drip of melting snow from the highest point of his roof. It was the sound of a world beginning to thaw. The process was agonizingly slow. The sun returned, a pale, watery disk in a washed-out sky, its warmth barely perceptible but present. The snow, which had been a fine, suffocating powder, began to compact under its own immense weight, turning into a dense, heavy mass. He knew that opening the main doors was impossible, they were buried under a drift that was likely 20 feet high or more. Instead, he turned his attention to a high-loading door in the hayloft, one he had designed for this very contingency. It took him the better part of 2 days. Using a combination of levers and a block and tackle, he fought against the pressure of the snow that had encased the upper half of the barn. The timbers groaned in protest, but they held. Finally, with a great, splintering crack, the door gave way, swinging inward to reveal a narrow tunnel through the ice-crusted snow. He shielded his eyes against the sudden, shocking brilliance of the light. The glare was blinding, reflecting off a surface of white that stretched to the horizon. When his vision adjusted, he looked out upon a landscape that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. The valley was gone. In its place was a vast, rolling desert of snow, its surface frozen into a hard, wind-scoured crust. Only the very tops of the tallest pine trees were visible, their upper branches jutting out like the fingers of a drowning man. He could see the spot where Samuel's homestead should be, but there was only a smooth, featureless mound of white. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no animals, no sign of life. It was a beautiful, pristine, and utterly dead world. The satisfaction of his own survival was a cold comfort, instantly replaced by the grim and heavy question of who else had endured the long, dark siege. He fashioned a crude pair of snowshoes from barrel staves and leather straps, the work of his hands a familiar comfort in the face of the unknown. The journey to Samuel's property was a slow, perilous trek across the frozen crust. The snow was a treacherous foundation, sometimes holding his weight, other times giving way and plunging him waist-deep into the soft, powdery depths beneath. The air was thin and bitingly cold, but the sun on the endless white was relentless, forcing him to squint against the glare. It took him half a day to cover the mile that had once been a casual ride. As he drew closer, the mound he had seen from the barn began to take on a more defined shape. He saw the sharp, splintered peak of a collapsed roofline poking through the snow. Samuel's barn, built to withstand a normal winter, had been crushed like a child's toy. The cabin itself was a deep pit in the snow, the roof sagging dangerously in the middle, with only a thin wisp of smoke curling from a makeshift chimney pipe. Abner called out, his voice sounding small and thin in the immense stillness. "Samuel! Are you in there?" There was a long pause, and then a muffled shout from within. A figure appeared at the top of the pit, slowly and painfully digging his way out. It was Samuel, but he was a changed man. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out and shadowed with a deep, weary trauma. He looked at Abner, standing tall and whole on the snowpack, and for a moment, he simply stared, as if seeing an apparition. "Abner," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. We thought everyone was gone." He gestured back toward the buried cabin. "The barn went in the first week. We lost the animals. All of them." He looked down at his hands, then back at Abner, a dawning realization in his eyes that went beyond mere surprise. The mockery, the friendly condescension, was gone, replaced by a raw and profound respect. "You knew," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "All that work. The walls. You knew this was coming." Abner nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the devastation. "The land told me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I just listened." He unslung a heavy sack from his shoulder, filled with salted pork, hardtack, and a small bag of coffee. "There's shelter at my place. And food. Bring your family." Samuel could only nod, the simple, practical offer of help a kindness so overwhelming it left no room for words. The wordless message of survival, carried by the thin trail of smoke from Abner's chimney, became a beacon in the white wasteland. Within a week, the few other survivors began to appear, drawn to the impossible structure that now stood as the only intact homestead in the entire valley. They arrived in ones and twos, desperate, half-starved, and haunted by what they had endured and what they had lost. The Finch family from the mercantile, having survived in their root cellar, were among the first after Samuel. Mr. Finch, who had once jokingly asked if Abner was expecting an army, now stood inside the great barn, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and shame. He looked at the towering stacks of firewood, the mountain of hay, the pens of living, breathing animals, and he understood. He had been measuring Abner's work against the yardstick of a world that no longer existed. Abner's folly had become their sanctuary. The cavernous interior, once a source of ridicule, was now a space of communal hope. Abner received them all without a word of reproach or a hint of triumph. He was the same quiet, methodical man he had always been, but his role had fundamentally changed. He was no longer the eccentric outcast, he was the anchor. He organized the able-bodied men, sending them out on rescue missions to the more remote cabins, their efforts guided by his knowledge of the land. He rationed the food with a firm but fair hand, ensuring everyone had a share. His barn became a barracks, a hospital, and a town hall all in one. The women tended to the sick and prepared communal meals in Abner's cabin, its warmth a comfort they had thought they would never feel again. The men who had laughed the loudest were now the ones who worked the hardest under his quiet direction, their labor a form of unspoken apology. They helped him dig out the main doors, a monumental task that took days of relentless effort. The snow and ice cleared away to reveal the world they had lost. In the evenings, they would gather in the lantern light, the massive, insulated walls of the barn shielding them from the lingering cold, and they would talk. They spoke of the signs they had all missed, the early frost, the strange behavior of the animals. They were signs that Abner alone had understood, not through some mystical gift, but through a lifetime of paying attention. The laughter was gone forever, replaced by the quiet, somber tones of people who had been humbled by the raw power of nature and saved by the wisdom of a man they had failed to understand. As the great thaw accelerated, turning the valley into a landscape of mud and rushing water, the true and terrible cost of the long winter was laid bare. Entire homesteads had vanished, scoured from their foundations by avalanches of snow. The herds of cattle that had been the region's lifeblood were gone, a catastrophic loss that would take a generation to rebuild. Of the 30 families that had lived in the valley, only 7 had survived, and they had done so because of one man's refusal to bend to convention. The barn on the high meadow ceased to be known as Abner's Folly. It was now simply called the Keep, a name spoken with a reverence usually reserved for a church or a fortress. It stood not as a monument to one man's eccentricity, but as a testament to a principle that had been etched into the collective memory of the survivors, that the land keeps its own counsel, and wisdom lies in listening to its quietest whispers. Abner himself never changed. He remained a solitary figure, even when surrounded by the community that now revered him. He sought no praise and accepted their gratitude with a simple, dignified nod. When spring finally returned in earnest, painting the ravaged land with the first hesitant greens of new life, he was already planning for the next winter, reinforcing a section of the roof, counting his supplies. The other men watched him, and this time, they learned. They built their new homes and barns differently, with deeper foundations, thicker walls, and a respect for the devastating potential of the seasons. The story of the old rancher who built a barn over his cabin became a founding legend of the rebuilt community, a tale told to children and grandchildren not as a strange anecdote, but as a lesson in foresight, resilience, and the quiet, unshakable power of a man who understood the world he lived in. The keep itself stood for another 50 years, long after Abner was gone, its great, weathered timbers a silent, enduring reminder of the winter that almost broke them and the unconventional wisdom that saw them through.